It crept in like winter fog over familiar roads, soft enough to seem harmless, cold enough to sink into my bones before I realized the warmth was gone. The laughter in my kitchen faded into polite murmurs. The embraces grew shorter, and every corner of my home felt like it was being measured for a future I wasn't invited to. I had built that place board by board, yet each day I felt a quiet hand tugging it from me, not in anger, but in a silence that hurt more than any fight. What happened next would tear apart more than walls and rooms. It would test the limits of how much a man can lose before he fights to take it all back. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you think will happen when the breaking point comes. And make sure you like and subscribe so you can see the ending I never saw coming. I had built my life and my home with my own hands. Each brick of that red brick house, holding a memory of my late wife. Each creak of the floorboards echoing the laughter of our children. That morning, I had been at the clinic for a routine checkup, thinking about stopping by the market afterward for fresh bread, but when I turned onto my street, my heart sank so hard I could feel it in my knees. Bright, glossy signs stood like intruders across my lawn, screaming in bold letters, "Luxury townhomes coming soon." I slowed my car, my eyes scanning the scene, trying to make sense of why strangers were walking around my yard, pointing at my porch, my windows, my chimney, as if assessing a thing they already owned. Several pickup trucks lined the curb, each bearing the name of a local construction company. Men in hard hats moved with the casual confidence of people who belonged there, their boots crunching on the gravel I had spread myself years ago. Confusion gave way to a surge of anger as I got out of my car and walked quickly toward the porch. One of the men, a stocky fellow with a clipboard, barely looked up from his papers before telling me, in a tone flat as concrete, that they were here to prepare for demolition. The word demolition hit me like a slap. I demanded to see what papers he was talking about, and he flipped the clipboard toward me. There, at the bottom of a thick packet of legal documents, was my name written in my own neat cursive, except I had never held a pen to that paper. I stared at it, my mind spinning between disbelief and rage. I told him this had to be a mistake, but he only tapped his finger against a highlighted section of the document, explaining that according to the signed contract, the seller, which supposedly was me, had 72 hours to vacate the property. My mouth went dry. 72 hours. That was all the time they were giving me to strip away 42 years of living, to pack every memory, every photograph, every piece of my life and walk away. As I tried to make sense of it, a black SUV pulled up to the curb, polished so clean the morning light bounced off it in sharp flashes. Out stepped my daughter Melissa. She wore a cream-colored coat that looked expensive, her hair styled to perfection, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked toward me. There was a faint smile on her face, the kind of smile people wear when they've already decided your opinion doesn't matter. "Dad," she said, her voice smooth but carrying an edge, "this is for the best." I asked her straight out if she knew about this, about my forged signature, and she didn't even flinch. She told me she had handled the negotiations herself, that the market was unstable, and that she had closed the deal quickly so I wouldn't miss the chance. The way she said it, as if she had done me a favor, made my skin crawl. I told her the price was far too low, and she shrugged, saying speed was more important than the final amount. I realized then that she had intentionally sold it for less than it was worth, not for my benefit, but to make sure the sale went through before I could object. My neighbors had begun to gather on the sidewalks, some whispering to each other, some just watching in silence, their eyes darting between us and the construction workers staking claim to my property. The foreman walked past US, issuing instructions, marking areas of the lawn with bright orange spray paint. I asked Melissa why she hadn't even spoken to me before doing this, and she replied calmly, "Because I knew you'd make it harder than it needed to be." Her tone was icy, as though my rights in my home were an inconvenience to her plans. She handed a folder back to the foreman, confirming something with him under her breath, and I saw her glance at her watch. In that moment, it became painfully clear this wasn't just a bad decision on her part. This was a calculated move. She had planned every detail, from forging my signature to securing the demolition crew before I could even smell trouble. Melissa stood there with that same cold smile, flanked by two people in crisp polo shirts with the logo of some senior wellness company. She introduced them as professionals here to evaluate my living situation and safety needs. I told her I didn't ask for any evaluation, but she brushed it off, claiming it was just a formality that might help with alternative housing arrangements. They walked through my home with clipboards in hand, taking notes as if I were a patient in some long-term care facility rather than the owner of the property. One of them asked where I kept my stove gas shut-off valve. Another examined my front door lock and scribbled something down. I felt their eyes lingering on me, searching for flaws to record, waiting for me to stumble on my words or lose my train of thought. I kept my answers sharp and clear, but that didn't stop them from quietly exchanging glances that dripped with condescension. After they left, Melissa lingered in the living room, flipping through her phone while pretending to wait for a ride. Her tone was light when she said, "See, that wasn't so bad," but her eyes betrayed that she was calculating something far deeper. I suspected she wasn't done, and by evening, my fears proved right. She returned with a printed copy of a preliminary assessment report from the so-called home health care staff. The report was a slap in the face. It claimed I frequently forget to lock the front door, misplace essential items such as medications, and demonstrate unsafe use of kitchen appliances, creating a fire hazard. I read it twice in disbelief. Not one word was true. I had lived alone for years without so much as burning toast, and my neighbors could attest to my routine of locking up every night. But the more I read, the more I saw how cleverly it was written. Each phrase framed as a professional observation, each detail vague enough to be impossible to disprove outright without witnesses. The language wasn't sloppy. It was precise, targeted, designed to paint a picture of someone who could not be trusted to live alone. I confronted Melissa immediately, demanding to know if she had put them up to this, and she didn't even bother denying it. Instead, she said, "Dad, this is going to make things smoother. It'll help the courts see why you need help managing your affairs." Her words sank in like ice water. She wasn't just selling my house. She was setting the stage to strip me of control over my life. That night, I barely slept, pacing the hallway as if walking would somehow keep the walls from closing in. By mid-morning the next day, I got my answer on just how far she was willing to go. A courier arrived at my door with an envelope stamped with the county court seal. Inside was a petition filed by Melissa to be granted temporary authority over my finances and property, citing recent professional assessments as evidence of my declining capacity. The report from the day before was attached in full, highlighted in yellow in the most damning sections. She had moved fast. Less than 24 hours from the time the so-called evaluators had walked through my door to the time she filed for legal control over everything I owned. I called the number on the court notice, trying to understand what this meant, and was told in a tone that barely masked impatience that I could respond or contest it, but the hearing date had already been set, only 2 weeks away. 2 weeks. In that time, she could easily advance the demolition process, move my belongings, and claim she was acting in my best interest all along. My chest tightened with a mix of fury and fear. She wasn't going to stop until she had everything: my home, my bank accounts, my independence. Worse yet, the paperwork was dressed up to look like she was rescuing me from myself, a dutiful daughter stepping in to help her confused father. I could already imagine the picture she'd paint for the judge: a frail old man losing his grip, resistant to change, and a caring daughter reluctantly doing what had to be done. But I wasn't frail, and I wasn't confused. I was under attack, and the battlefield was no longer just my house. It was the system itself. My mailbox had never needed a lock before. The neighborhood was safe and quiet. I tried the small ring of house keys in my pocket, but none of them fit, and I immediately knew Melissa had something to do with it. My first thought was to call the post office, but before I could, I noticed a small pink slip tucked into the hinge gap. It stated that all future correspondence will be redirected to the authorized forwarding address on file. My stomach tightened when I read the forwarding address: Melissa's home. She hadn't just locked me out of my own mailbox. She had rerouted every piece of mail, from bank statements to court letters, directly to herself. It was a calculated move, cutting off my access to information while giving her full control over anything sent to me. I marched back to the house to call the postal service, but halfway there, I spotted a white van pulling into my driveway. The logo on the side read Heritage Hearts, preserving senior stories. Two young people in casual clothes jumped out, cameras slung around their shoulders, followed by a woman with a clipboard who smiled far too widely for someone uninvited. She introduced herself as a producer for a documentary about elderly living and said that Melissa had given them permission to film a day in my life for a family keepsake. I told them firmly they were not welcome, but before I could physically block them, one of the camera operators was already stepping over my threshold, lens raised, capturing close-ups of my coffee table and kitchen counter. They moved with speed and purpose, deliberately focusing on anything that could be made to look like clutter: a pair of reading glasses next to an open book, yesterday's coffee mug beside the sink, a laundry basket I hadn't put away yet. The clipboard woman made small talk, asking leading questions like, "Do you ever find it hard to keep up with chores? Or have you ever left the stove on by mistake?" I refused to answer, but she nodded as if I had confirmed something, jotting notes without breaking eye contact. I followed them from room to room, telling them to leave, but they ignored me, filming the smallest imperfections as if they were symptoms of decline. Within 15 minutes, they had what they wanted and left as quickly as they'd arrived, the van pulling away before I could even think of calling the police. My hands shook as I stood in the doorway, knowing exactly what Melissa intended to do with that footage. That evening, my suspicion was confirmed when my cousin in Ohio called me, his voice low and hesitant. He said he had received a video from Melissa showing clips of me in my home, accompanied by narration about how difficult it's been for Dad to manage things lately. The footage was heavily edited, cutting out the moments I told them to leave, instead zooming in on dust on a shelf, a single unwashed plate, and a shot of me rubbing my temples while reading mail. The narration painted me as a man overwhelmed and confused, hinting that I might not be safe living on my own. My cousin said Melissa had sent it to concerned family members to rally support for her guardianship petition. I felt a sick mix of fury and humiliation. Not only had she stripped my privacy, but she had weaponized my own home against me. It dawned on me that between the forged demolition contract, the false health evaluation, and now the stage documentary, she was constructing a paper-in video trail to convince everyone, from the courts to my blood relatives, that I was incapable. She was turning my life into a case file, one carefully edited to erase any trace of my competence. The lock on my mailbox meant I wouldn't even see the official notices or bills that might prove otherwise. I paced the living room, my eyes landing on the half-packed boxes again, and I realized that if I didn't act soon, I wouldn't just lose my house, I'd lose the ability to make decisions about my own life entirely. I knew Melissa was accelerating her plan, and I was running out of time to stop her. So when Craig called 2 days later, using a voice that was artificially warm, I was instantly suspicious. He said he wanted to clear the air and invited me over for dinner, insisting Melissa would be there too, and that we could talk like a family before things went too far. I didn't want to go, but I also knew that refusing would just give them another reason to claim I was being uncooperative or paranoid. So I agreed, locking my front door behind me, double-checking the windows, and heading out. Their mansion was everything my house wasn't. Grand stone pillars at the entrance, perfectly manicured hedges, and a driveway long enough to hold 10 cars. When I stepped inside, I was greeted by the sterile scent of lemon polish and the gleam of marble floors. Melissa was in the kitchen, sipping wine, while Craig ushered me into the dining room with exaggerated hospitality. The table was set with more silverware than anyone could possibly need, the plates white and glossy like they'd never been used. We made small talk at first, but it was all surface level. Comments about the weather, Melissa's new fitness class, Craig's latest business deal. Not once did either of them mention the demolition contract, the fake health report, or the stolen mail. I sat there, tense, my fork untouched, my eyes scanning the room for clues as to why they'd brought me here. Halfway through the meal, I noticed Melissa kept glancing at her phone, her lips twitching in a faint smirk. Craig leaned in and started telling me a story about how stressful renovations could be, how sometimes you just had to make tough decisions for the sake of progress. It sounded rehearsed, like he was trying to plant the idea that what they were doing was somehow noble. An hour later, dinner ended abruptly when Craig claimed he had an early meeting and Melissa said she needed to get up early to meet a contractor. I thanked them for the meal, though the taste of it was long gone from my mouth, replaced by the bitterness of distrust. The moment I got back to my own driveway, something felt wrong. The porch light I'd left on was dark. The curtains in the living room were drawn differently than I'd left them. My gut twisted as I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. My house felt hollow. The hum of the refrigerator was still there, but the warmth, the clutter, the life of it gone. I walked from room to room, and a shock hit me like waves. My bookshelf, once filled with decades of reading, was stripped bare. The armchair I'd inherited from my father was missing from the corner. In the garage, the shelves were empty. The pegboard where my tools once hung was nothing but bare hooks. The worst blow came when I reached for the old wooden toolbox under the workbench, the same one I'd carried to every job site for 40 years. It was gone. They hadn't just taken random items. They'd targeted the things that mattered most, the irreplaceable pieces of my life that held my history. My hands shook as I opened closet after closet, only to find gaps where my belongings had been. I called Melissa's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I called Craig, and he answered on the second ring with an infuriatingly casual hello. I demanded to know if they'd been in my house, and he chuckled, saying, "We just help speed things along for you. You don't need all that old junk." Old junk. That toolbox had built homes, repaired furniture, and fixed more than I could count, including the crib Melissa had slept in as a baby. I drove back to their mansion, my pulse pounding, but when I stepped into their front hall, the reason for the dinner invitation became painfully clear. There in their living room, positioned like art pieces, were my things. My father's armchair sat in the corner with a decorative pillow thrown over it. My bookshelf had been filled with their designer trinkets. On a side table, my wife's antique clock ticked away as if it had always belonged there. And in the corner against the wall was my toolbox, polished, cleaned, and displayed like some vintage collectible. The sight of it sitting and used, its scars and scratches stripped of their meaning, was enough to make my chest ache. Melissa appeared at the top of the stairs, holding a wine glass, her eyes flicking over me with mild amusement. "It looks better here," she said casually, as if she were discussing a piece of art she'd moved for aesthetic purposes. After all, we had once been close, especially after his mother passed. I told him exactly what had happened, how Melissa and Craig had orchestrated a dinner to get me out of my house while they sent people to strip it bare. I expected outrage, maybe even an offer to help me get my things back. Instead, Tyler's tone was calm, almost rehearsed. He told me not to overreact, and then said there was a better way to resolve things by meeting his lawyer. He claimed this lawyer could mediate between me and Melissa to avoid any legal escalation. I should have known better, but at that moment, I was desperate for some semblance of reason in the family. I agreed to meet. Tyler gave me an address in a downtown office building. When I arrived, the floor was quiet, the hallway long and carpeted in a way that smelled faintly of stale coffee. Tyler greeted me with a quick handshake and introduced a man named Stephen Ward. Stephen wore a sharp navy suit, a gold tie clip, and an expression that seemed carved into place. He invited me into a small conference room where the blinds were drawn and a stack of folders sat neatly in front of him. Without much preamble, he began to explain my situation. According to him, the sale of my house was lawfully executed, and Melissa, acting as my power of attorney, had full legal authority to sell it. I cut him off immediately, pointing out that the power of attorney was obtained under false pretenses and missing proper notarization, but he brushed my words aside with a dismissive wave. That's when he leaned forward, lowered his voice, and told me that if I continued to interfere with the transfer of property or tried to remove items from Melissa and Craig's mansion, they could sue me for breach of contract and theft of jointly owned assets. The words hit like a slap, and for a moment I wondered if I had walked into a trap. I studied his face, the way his mouth curled ever so slightly at the corners, and it clicked. This man wasn't some neutral party, and he wasn't Tyler's independent attorney. The smugness in his tone was the same one I'd heard from Craig more than once. I asked Stephen directly if he knew Craig, and he didn't answer right away. Instead, Tyler shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, and tried to redirect the conversation back to solutions. That was all the confirmation I needed. This wasn't mediation. This was intimidation dressed up in legal jargon. I stood to leave, telling Tyler I wouldn't be bullied into giving up what was mine. As I reached the door, Stephen's voice followed me, casually warning that the optics weren't in my favor and that I should think about how this would look to a judge, an old man fighting against his own children, refusing their help. I didn't respond, but my hands were clenched so tight my knuckles ached by the time I stepped into the hallway. I thought that would be the end of it, but the real punch to the gut came 2 days later. My phone rang early in the morning, and it was my cousin from Florida, sounding uneasy. He told me that Tyler had sent an email to our entire extended family, cousins, aunts, uncles, even distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. The email painted me as a stubborn, prideful old man who refused to accept his limitations. It said I was determined to live alone in unsafe conditions and unwilling to accept the generosity of my children. The worst part was the closing line. It's clear Dad plans to leech off family resources for the rest of his life if we don't step in now. My cousin said some family members had already replied, offering to chip in for my care, as if I were some charity case instead of a man who had worked his whole life and paid for everything he owned. I hung up the phone and sat at my kitchen table, staring at the bare walls where my photographs used to hang, the echo of their absence louder than the silence in the room. Tyler's betrayal cut deeper than Melissa's in some ways. Melissa had always been ambitious, sometimes ruthless, but Tyler had been my rock when his mother died. I had trusted him to stand up for me, not stand beside those trying to dismantle my life. Now, it was clear he wasn't just passively going along with Melissa's schemes. He was actively contributing to them, using my own family network to smear me before I could defend myself. That email wasn't just a character assassination. It was groundwork for the next phase of their plan, poisoning the well so that when the court date came, the narrative would already be set. I realized then that my children weren't operating on emotion anymore. It was as if my own children had pulled a curtain over my life, shutting me out from everyone who might help. The court hearing over Melissa's petition to take control of my affairs was still a week away when she showed up at my door one morning with two men I'd never seen before. They introduced themselves as transition coordinators and informed me they were there to assist with my relocation. Before I could object, Melissa stepped forward holding a folder of paperwork and told me it was already arranged for me to move into a place called Meadowbrook Assisted Living. She said it with a tone that left no room for discussion, like she was announcing the weather. I told her I wasn't going anywhere, but the coordinators kept insisting they were just there to help make the process easier. My house was already half empty from the theft disguised as that dinner at Craig's. And with my mail still being intercepted, I had no way of knowing what kind of legal groundwork they had in play. I decided not to fight them on the doorstep. There were too many eyes watching from across the street, and I knew any scene I made would become another weapon in their narrative against me. I packed a small duffel bag with clothes, my shaving kit, and the few personal items they hadn't stolen, and I let them drive me to Meadowbrook. The building looked fine from the outside, brick walls, trimmed hedges, a freshly painted sign, but the inside told a different story. The air smelled faintly of bleach, trying to mask something sour. The carpets were worn thin in the hallways, the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and the sound of a television echoed from somewhere down the corridor with no one bothering to turn the volume down. The room they led me to was at the far end of the building, next to a supply closet and directly across from the laundry room, where industrial machines roared from morning until night. The walls were a dull beige, scuffed, and peeling at the corners, and the single window looked out onto a parking lot filled with dumpsters. There was a bed no bigger than a cot, a nightstand with a drawer that stuck when you tried to open it, and a dresser that leaned slightly to one side. Later, I would learn that this room was the cheapest unit in the facility, and it became clear why. Melissa had worked out a deal with the manager to minimize costs. That phrase, when I overheard it in passing, made my blood boil. They weren't interested in my comfort or well-being. They wanted to spend as little money as possible while still pretending they were taking care of me. The first night there, I barely slept, the thumping of laundry machines and the constant creak of carts in the hallway, making sure of it. Meals were bland and lukewarm, served on plastic trays that looked like they belonged in a high school cafeteria. The staff was polite enough, but stretched too thin. One nurse admitted she was responsible for nearly 20 residents on her shift. Days blurred together in that place. The television in the shared lounge played the same channels over and over, and residents shuffled aimlessly between the dining hall and their rooms, most too tired or disinterested to speak. The only contact I had for my children came in the form of brief, hollow visits. In 3 months, Melissa and Craig came by only twice, and Tyler once, each time bringing glossy real estate magazines that they would flip through while making small talk. They showed me photos of houses in their new neighborhood, talking about property values, gourmet kitchens, and backyard pools as if I cared, as if these conversations weren't happening in a room that smelled faintly of mildew. I started to see a pattern in their visits. They were there not to check on me, but to make sure I hadn't caused trouble or found a way to contact anyone who might intervene. The second time Melissa visited, she made a point of mentioning how peaceful I seemed now that I didn't have to worry about the house anymore. She said it with a smile that was almost a warning. They thought they had me cornered, tucked away in a forgotten wing of an understaffed facility, out of sight and out of mind. What they didn't realize was that isolation has a way of sharpening a mind. I spent my days watching, listening, learning how the staff rotated shifts, figuring out when the public phone near the lobby was least supervised. I had used my time in that place to memorize staff routines, to figure out exactly when I could slip down to the lobby and use the public phone without the watchful eyes of the administrators who Melissa had clearly instructed to keep tabs on me. One Tuesday afternoon, when a nurse assigned to my wing was busy dealing with a resident who had fallen in the hallway, I saw my opening. I walked calmly down the corridor, past the TV room where an old Western was playing, and straight into the lobby where the phone hung on the wall next to a dusty rack of outdated brochures. I dialed a number I had kept memorized for years, a number I had never thought I'd have to use in desperation. Harold Lawson. Harold had been one of my closest friends since high school, the man who had stood beside me as best man at my wedding, and later, the man who became one of the most respected attorneys in our county before retiring. When he picked up, his voice still carried that steady, commanding tone I remembered, and for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of control return to me. I told him everything. How Melissa had forged the demolition contract, the fake health assessment, the stolen mail, the stage documentary, the dinner distraction, the intimidation meeting with Tyler's lawyer, the email smear campaign, and now the forced move into Meadowbrook. I could hear the silence on the other end as he processed it all, followed by a low whistle. Then, without hesitation, he told me to sit tight and keep my head down until he could dig into the paperwork. He still had contacts at the county clerk's office, the land records department, and even a few judges who remembered him. 2 days later, he called me back, his voice sharper now, carrying the edge of a man who had found exactly the kind of ammunition I needed. First, he told me that the power of attorney Melissa had used to sell my house wasn't just suspicious, it was legally void. The notarization was incomplete, missing the required witness signatures, and the document had never been properly filed with the court. In legal terms, it was a house of cards, and all it would take was the right push to bring it down. Second, and perhaps more importantly, Harold had tracked the sale of my house and followed the money. He discovered that the funds from that sale had been used directly to purchase Melissa and Craig's new mansion. Under state property law, because the sale had been unauthorized and I had been a co-owner of the original property, I still retained co-ownership rights to any asset purchased with those funds. That meant, in plain language, that the mansion they were so proud of, the one where my father's armchair and my wife's antique clock now sat like trophies, was legally mine just as much as it was theirs. Hearing that nearly knocked the wind out of me, not from disbelief, but from the sudden, almost dizzying realization that the game had shifted. They hadn't just stolen from me. They had inadvertently tied themselves to me in a way that gave me leverage I hadn't imagined. Harold told me to say nothing to them yet. If they sensed I knew, they might try to sell the mansion quickly, move the money, or find another way to complicate the trail. Instead, he would begin preparing the legal filings to challenge the sale of my house, void the power of attorney, and assert my ownership rights over the mansion. As he spoke, I could almost see the pieces moving in my mind, the walls of Meadowbrook fading as a new path opened before me. For months, Melissa and Tyler and Craig had been on the offensive, striking blow after blow while I was cornered. But Harold's discovery was more than just a lifeline. It was the first real weapon I'd had in this fight. I hung up the phone that day with my pulse racing, my mind already rehearsing how I would walk back into that mansion, not as a guest, not as a burden, but as a rightful owner. He told me we had to strike before Melissa, Craig, or Tyler caught wind of what we knew. For the next several days, I stayed quiet, playing the part of the docile resident at Meadowbrook, all while Harold was meeting with clerks, pulling property records, and drafting filings with the court. Each time I managed to get to the public phone, he updated me with steady confidence, his voice the lifeline that kept me from losing my composure. He had already secured an emergency hearing date, arguing that my rights to the property and my safety were being actively threatened by the actions of my children. When the day of the hearing came, Harold arranged for me to be picked up from Meadowbrook by a driver he trusted, avoiding any chance of Melissa finding out before I arrived at the courthouse. I walked into that courtroom feeling the weight of months of humiliation, betrayal, and stolen dignity pressing against my ribs, but also carrying the quiet knowledge that for the first time, I was not walking in alone. Melissa and Craig were already there, dressed in coordinated shades of gray, as if they were attending a business luncheon rather than a legal proceeding about their exploitation of their own father. Tyler sat behind them, his arms crossed, his eyes flicking toward me with a mix of irritation and disbelief, as though I had wandered into a place I didn't belong. When the judge took the bench, Harold presented our case with the calm authority of a man who knew every move the other side had made and how to dismantle it piece by piece. He started with the power of attorney, laying out the missing notarization, the absent witness signatures, and the failure to file the document properly. Then he moved to the financial trail, showing how the proceeds from the unauthorized sale of my house were used directly to purchase their mansion. He cited state property laws that clearly outlined my co-ownership rights, presenting the records in neat, chronological order, each page another nail in the coffin of their scheme. Melissa's attorney, an expensive-looking man I had never seen before, tried to argue that I had verbally agreed to the sale and that the funds had been gifted to her as part of an estate planning conversation. Harold didn't even flinch. He produced a sworn affidavit from a neighbor who had overheard Melissa admitting she sold the house without my consent, and from another who had seen me locked out of my mailbox. Then, as if to twist the knife, Harold introduced the video footage Melissa had sent to relatives, the edited documentary of my supposed decline. He played both her version and the raw, unedited footage that one of the cameramen, disgruntled over not being paid in full, had leaked to us. The contrast was damning. By the time Harold finished, the judge's face was a mask of restrained anger. She turned to Melissa and Craig, her voice cold and sharp, and delivered words I'd been waiting to hear for months. What you have done amounts to gross exploitation of a vulnerable family member. The ruling was swift and decisive. The court declared the power of attorney null and void, restored full control of my finances and legal decisions to me, and affirmed my co-ownership of the mansion. Effective immediately, I was granted the legal right to reside in the property, with full access to all common areas and amenities. In addition, the judge ordered that certain personal items, specifically my late wife's wedding ring, our family photo albums, and my father's armchair, be returned to me within 7 days. The order was final and enforceable by law, meaning if they refused, they could face contempt charges. Melissa's face tightened as the ruling was read, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Craig's jaw shifted, the muscle twitching as if he were biting back comment. Tyler wouldn't meet my eyes at all, staring down at the table as though the wood grain might offer him an escape. When the hearing adjourned, Harold patted my shoulder and said quietly, "Now we move you home." The morning after the judge's ruling, Harold's driver pulled up to Meadowbrook with the kind of quiet efficiency that made it clear he had handled situations like mine before. I stepped outside carrying the same worn leather suitcase I had brought when Melissa forced me out of my own home, except now it wasn't filled with the remnants of a life I'd been told to abandon. It carried clothes, a few personal items, and the court order that gave me the right to walk into that mansion without permission from anyone. When we pulled up to the property, the driveway that had once looked imposing and untouchable now felt like a path I was reclaiming. The stone pillars that flanked the entrance, the manicured hedges, the long expanse of concrete leading to the front steps, all of it was as much mine as it was theirs now, whether they liked it or not. Melissa opened the door before I could knock, wearing a pale blouse and forced politeness on her face. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and her knuckles whitened on the edge of the door as she stepped aside to let me in. Craig stood behind her, his posture stiff, one hand buried in his pocket, while the other gripped his phone as if waiting for a call that might save him from this moment. I wheeled my suitcase across the threshold, the click of its wheels on the marble floor echoing in the high-ceiling foyer. The smell of lemon polish and expensive candles was exactly as I remembered from the night of that stage dinner, but now it carried no sense of intimidation. I was not a visitor. I was a co-owner. I took my time looking around, letting the weight of my presence settle into the air. Melissa muttered something about showing me to my room, her voice tight, but I told her I would choose for myself. I walked through the mansion slowly, noting each piece of furniture and every familiar item they had taken from my old home. My father's armchair was still in the corner of the living room, the antique clock ticking steadily on the mantel, the bookshelf now stripped of their decorative trinkets and holding only a few designer coffee table books. In the dining room, sunlight streamed in through wide windows, illuminating the gleam of the long table where they had once plotted against me. Craig followed a few steps behind, his phone ringing once before he silenced it. His eyes darted toward Melissa, and I caught the flicker of something there, worry, maybe even panic. That flicker made sense when Harold called me into his office later that afternoon to update me on something new he'd learned. Craig's construction supply business, the one he had bragged about at that dinner, was under an active audit by the state. Several contracts were flagged for irregularities, and some of the loans tied to the mansion's purchase had been secured using income projections that were now under question. If that wasn't enough, Harold had also confirmed that the mansion had thousands of dollars in unpaid property taxes, a fact conveniently ignored in their lavish spending, but now impossible to hide. Melissa hadn't heard that part yet, but the strain was already starting to show. Over the next few days, I noticed the phone calls she took in hushed tones, the quick exits from the room when certain names appeared on the caller ID. Friends who had once crowded their weekend gatherings began to vanish from their social calendar. The laughter and clinking glasses that had once filled these rooms on Saturday nights were replaced by the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of Melissa pacing upstairs. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. Harold had been right about word getting around. The court case had made its way into conversations at Melissa's gym, the boutique store she frequented, and even the book club she hosted once a month. A neighbor I barely knew mentioned in passing that people were talking about how she had tried to take everything from her father and lost in a very public way. Melissa tried to carry herself as if nothing had changed, but the tension in her shoulders and the clipped edge to her voice betrayed her. Even Craig seemed different now, avoiding eye contact with me in the kitchen and spending long stretches away from home. I settled into the mansion without apology, unpacking my clothes in a bright upstairs bedroom with a view of the rose garden. The irony wasn't lost on me. This garden had been one of the selling points Melissa loved to brag about, but now it was just as much mine. Each morning, I made coffee in the oversized kitchen, reading the newspaper at the breakfast bar as Melissa moved around me in stiff silence. At first, they tried to maintain appearances, hosting small gatherings instead of the lavish parties they were known for. But even those became infrequent as the financial pressure mounted. Craig's audit turned into a full-scale investigation, and more than one contract under his business was flagged as fraudulent, leading to penalties that drained accounts they had thought were untouchable. I noticed the changes in small ways. First, the luxury SUV disappearing from the driveway, then the sports car that had been Craig's pride and joy quietly vanishing one morning. Delivery trucks that used to bring catered food for their events stopped coming, and the pantry that once overflowed with imported goods began to look like an ordinary kitchen. Melissa's wardrobe, which had been a rotating display of designer pieces, began to repeat outfits. She still left the house with her chin high, but her hands fidgeted more, and she no longer lingered in conversations with the neighbors. The whispers in the community had grown into open discussions, the details of our court case passing between acquaintances like currency. People stopped pretending they didn't know, and the polite smiles Melissa received in public now carried the sharp edge of judgment. Craig, increasingly absent, began staying away for nights at a time, his phone calls to the house growing shorter and more strained until, one day, he simply didn't come back. I heard through Harold's network that he had moved into a small condo near his office. The separation framed as temporary, but understood by everyone to be the beginning of the end. With Craig gone, the full weight of their crumbling situation fell on Melissa. Bills arrived in thick envelopes, and more than once I caught her sitting at the dining table late at night, head bowed over stacks of paperwork. Jewelry boxes that had once been filled with glittering pieces began to empty. One afternoon, I saw her leave with a small velvet pouch and return with a look that told me she had traded more than just gold for cash. The tension in the house was heavy, but it no longer touched me the way it once would have. I had my own routines now. Morning coffee in the kitchen, afternoons spent reading in the library, evenings walking through the rose garden that bloomed in stubborn defiance of the chaos inside. I spoke little to Melissa, but when I did, my words were polite and measured. She avoided me most days, unable to look me in the eye for long. And when she did, it was as though she saw a reflection of every choice that had led her here. One crisp autumn evening, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and took it out to the wide front porch, the air carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from a nearby fireplace. The sun was setting, spilling gold across the lawn, and I sat back in the rocking chair that had once been stored in my old home, now firmly placed where I could watch the world go by. I thought about the months that had passed, the night I returned to find demolition signs in my yard, the forced evaluations, the stolen mail, the stage documentary, the robbery disguised as dinner, the intimidation, the isolation at Meadowbrook, and every calculated move meant to strip me of my dignity. I thought about Harold's voice on the phone, steady and unshaken, guiding me back to the truth of what I owned and who I was. Most of all, I thought about how easy it had been for them to justify what they did, dressing it up as help, convincing themselves they were doing what was best. But the truth was simple. They wanted what wasn't theirs, and they underestimated the resolve of the man they were trying to erase. As the light faded, I realized that this victory wasn't about punishing them, though the unraveling of their perfect life was its own kind of justice. It was about reclaiming what was mine, not just the property or the possessions, but my name, my place, and my self-respect. I hadn't won by striking back with the same cruelty they had shown me. I had won by standing firm, using the truth and the law to pull the ground out from under their lies. The porch creaked softly beneath me as I rocked, the coffee warm in my hands, the garden glowing in the last light of the day. Inside, I could hear Melissa moving quietly, the clink of dishes and the muted shuffle of papers. Whatever came next for her, I knew it would be shaped by the choices she had made, the ones that had brought her to this moment. For me, the fight was over, and the peace that settled in its place was worth every sleepless night and every battle fought along the way. Justice had been served, not through revenge, but through the simple, unshakable act of taking back what was always mine. The end. If you stayed with me through this whole story, I want to hear what you think. Did you see that ending coming, or did it surprise you? Tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and what part of my fight hit you the hardest. And if you want more stories like mine, true fights for justice told from the heart, make sure you like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Every click, every comment, And every share helps keep these stories alive, and I'd love to know your thoughts.